Joining us today, we have Charles Jennings, co-founder of the 70-20-10 Institute. Charles, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, Rob.
So Charles, being the co-founder of the 70-20-10 Institute, I'd like to kick off and sort of get your explanation of what is the 70-20-10 theory, and on top of that, why is social learning so important to enterprise learning?
Oh, sure, yeah. 70-20-10 is a framework, and as a framework, it's a reference model. It describes the fact that most of the learning that happens through and with other people and as part of daily workflow. And there's a big body of research that shows that, we learn most by doing stuff and by talking to people and getting help from people and helping other people and so on. So the social element in that is the 20. Originally, the numbers come from research done back in the 1980s when, I guess, work wasn't so social. We worked in more structured organizations than we do now. We didn't have all this wonderful technology that we've got now. So it was interesting that the 20 bit in the original bit of research where the numbers come from showed that that was the 20 was the social learning from others and with others. That was probably less, I'm sure it was less than what happens now. I'm sure that's increased a lot. So in terms of the overall framework, it really is a way to set a North Star to the fact that we learn formally, we learn through formal courses and programs. They're really useful. Very often when we start a new role or start in a new organization, just to get that direction. And then the 70 and 20 kick in, because if we want to build real expertise, we never do it purely through formal learning. We do it through knowing the principles, being able to do the job, then by doing the job, by challenging assignments, by working with exemplary performers, by having coaches, by all these sorts of things which actually help us build expertise over time.
So can you help me?
No, go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that, Gary. So can you help me understand a little bit more? What can organizations do to really build out that coaching model, and maybe in particular, how can they use technology to build that model out?
Wow, that's difficult to answer because all sorts of different organizations do this well or aspire to do it well for different reasons. I mean, I was a chief learning officer at Reuters, then Thomson Reuters, for about 8 years. And when I was at Reuters, that organization really understood the importance of social learning or exploiting and building on social learning and experiential learning, because the CEO, a man called Tom Gloser, really understood it. And so it was driven from the top. Other organizations, it's driven from the center or even from the bottom, depending on what they're trying to do. In some cases, it's almost impossible to do your job unless you do your job with other people. I must admit, I've always found it rather strange that many organizations still go through this cycle of doing an annual performance review, and they sit down with you, Rob, or with me, and they would say, we'd have our review with our manager, and yet we all know that virtually none of us achieve our objectives every year without relying on other people to help us. So the social element of work is really critical. And so, we need to sort of think about that as we as learning and development professionals, in my case, or we as managers, think about how we can help build high performance across our organization. And I guess if you're thinking about or talking about culture, about building a culture of, I would say a culture of high performance, a culture of continuous learning or whatever, we need to continuously think about how we can support this, whether we're supporting it by building really, really effective formal learning programs which exploit the opportunities created by groups of people working in teams, working with others, or whether it's designed to exploit the fact that we need to go beyond just developing knowledge and skills and make sure that they're embedded in the way in which we do our work, and we build that competence into expertise and other ways. So it's really fundamental, I think, to us as humans. We're social animals as human beings. So we better get damn good at exploiting the way that we use the social elements for building our own capability and performing, or else we're going to underperform.
Sure, that makes sense to me. What would you say then if people weren't to take on this kind of social learning initiative? What would be some of the repercussions of not having that in a business?
Well, I can think of a number, Kerry, immediately. The first is, if you're looking to create and support organizations, the level of innovation in organizations, we really need to talk to each other and need to exchange ideas. And organizations which are innovative, can respond to change rapidly, particularly in the current climate, are those organizations that will succeed. Those organizations that can't change and respond to the changing pressures and changing demands won't succeed. And so that's one imperative. The other element, I think, is a former colleague of mine, a wonderful man called Jay Cross, who sadly died 5 years ago. But Jay was one of the founding fathers of informal learning. In fact, Jay was the first person to use the term e-learning. And Jay always said, one of his axioms, I guess, was that that conversation is the greatest technology ever invented. And so, although our technologies are really important to us, that social component, that conversation, is absolutely critical. And if we work in organizations where conversations, building networks, exchanging ideas are encouraged, and if we build that into our formal learning solutions, we encourage it informally, we encourage it across the organization, that is a likely indicator that our organizations will flourish. And if we're talking about building a learning organization or a social organization, those are the sorts of indicators that we look for.
So, we're in an interesting climate currently, obviously with COVID and the majority of workplaces now working remotely. I'm curious to get your take on how organizations, and particularly the high-performing ones, can leverage technology in this moment to bring informal learning and social learning to their people.
I think that's a really good question, Rob, because over the last few months, I've been reflecting on the use of technology for learning. Now, my background, I headed up the United Kingdom's Centre for Collaborative Learning in a business school 25 years ago. I was a professor in a business school, and we did a lot of research around social collaborative learning, online learning. And I was involved in launching the world's first pure online MBA back in 1995, so 25 years ago. And I've been sitting sort of waiting as things slowly changed. And it's a little bit like digital transformation. HR departments and consultancies and so on have been working for the last few years in terms of digital transformation. And along comes a little virus that initiates and basically drives greater digital transformation that's been driven in most organizations over the last 4 or 5 years. Along comes a virus which has driven something I've been passionate about for a long time, which is technology-enabled learning. Has driven that faster than anything else that it ever has. And it's really intriguing. I'm not suggesting that I think that the move we're seeing, the mad move from or the mad rush from face-to-face learning into digital-based online learning, I'm not suggesting that all of it is great, because I'm sure a lot of it isn't great, because it's what I'd almost call shovelware, a lot of it, where they're shoveling content from classrooms into online without really having good frameworks around it. But nonetheless, I think what this last few months has taught us is the fact that technology can really enable us to get reach, whereby we weren't able to get reach without moving people around. So we can get reach without moving people around. And almost going back to the Evans and Verster model back in 20 years ago, a couple of guys called Evans and Verster wrote a book called Blown to Bits, which was really about how the digital revolution was changing things. And they talked about the richness and reach trade-off. So without technology, we can create wonderfully rich learning environments. But if we're going to scale those and give them reach, we absolutely need technology. And the argument always used to be, well, that's great, but the technology really inhibits you. So you can't get, you can't do a leadership development work unless you bring people together, for example. Or there always used to be the argument about the great richness of bringing people together, and that e-learning or learning technologies were never going to be able to replace the face-to-face. I think that we're seeing the fact that in many ways, digital technology does replace that. For example, using tools like even the standard communication tools like Zoom and Microsoft Teams and things like this, they allow us to communicate pretty damn well. It's different. It's actually, in my experience, it's much more tiring. I've chaired a couple of 2 half-day, or two 6-hour sessions over the last couple of weeks with about 50 chief learning officers, and it's damn tiring. I'd say it's more tiring than sitting in a room with them, but it allows us to do this, and I think it allows us to really exploit opportunities for supporting people to do their jobs and do their jobs well, and therefore learn and improve. Developing this culture of continuous improvement and continuous development. Technology is absolutely critical in order to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say, and I've kind of experienced it myself. It's almost like Zoom burnout, where I'm on Zoom quite a bit during the week, and so on the weekend, my family, let's say, will want to set up a Zoom dinner or something, and I'm like, I don't know if I can sit behind my computer anymore.
Yeah, I know exactly how you feel. It's that. It absolutely is. I think it requires a level of concentration.
Yeah.
Is not needed in face-to-face. And I'm sure the psychologists will tell us all about this in retrospect, but it certainly is a different experience, but it doesn't make it any less, I think.
Yeah. So how have you noticed, maybe during this time, but maybe just kind of throughout your career previous to this, how have you seen the shift in social learning across kind of, corporate learning cultures? How's that changed?
Social learning has always been with us. It's not something we've created. As I said earlier on, humans are social animals.
Mm-hmm.
We communicate and live socially. A great hero of mine, Jerome Brunner, one of the greatest educational psychologists, once said, "Our world is others." In other words, without other people, our world actually doesn't exist. So it's nothing new in terms of the way that humans learn socially. I think what is happening is that there's an increased awareness, particularly from the perspective of learning professionals, HR professionals, and professionals who are responsible for building capability in organizations and helping our people to do better and helping our organizations to do better. There's been an increasing awareness that the social element is really important. In the past, if you started in a job, and particularly this is thinking back in the industrial society, you went through comprehensive training programs. It might have been an apprenticeship or it might have been some sort of qualification. And then it was expected that you could do your job. And there wasn't really a social element in that, except, I guess, in terms of a lot of the trades, you would have a master tradesman and you would have an apprentice. So the master and apprentice model acknowledged the social element. But I think we lost that to a certain extent for maybe 30 or 40, 50 years. And it was assumed that we could put people through, and formal training became the dominant way in which we help build capability. And we're moving away from that now. There's no doubt we're moving away from that. And I think 70-20-10 is one small element of that says if we want to help people reach their optimum level of performance, we want them to continuously improve, we need to focus on how they interact and that social learning. And in fact, we know there's a chap called Rob Cross, who's an academic in the US academic. And Rob has been working on social network analysis for many years. And Rob is really the top guy. If you want to talk about social networks, Rob is the top guy to go to. And his research has shown that he did a very interesting research study with managers to show that managers who are better connected across their organization are better performers. So just that fact should tell us something. If you're better connected, you're more likely to be a better performer. I'm sure that there are other studies that have been carried out to show not just on managers, but on other workers. And I would guess that would be the same. So simply by having better quality networks, building, maintaining, thinking about how you build your social networks. More diverse networks seem to be indicators of higher performance. So there is a clear link between social activity and performance. And that clear link, I guess, then goes back into thinking about, okay, how can we exploit that? And I think technology comes in there and says, look, technology provides us the ability, just as now I'm sitting here in Winchester, Hampshire, in the United Kingdom. You're both sitting somewhere in the US. We can be having a conversation. We can see each other. We can talk to each other in this way. We can engage socially. Those technologies, and then when we build those technologies into learning systems to support formal learning, of course, they're extremely likely to improve the quality of the output.
So, Charles, on the executive level, I'm curious, and this might be a bit more of a framework question, but as organizations do try to shift their programs from a primarily formal delivery method and to integrate social learning into their programs, what type of things can they be doing to sort of build that culture? Are there things that you can do from an enterprise level to really instill that sort of knowledge sharing mentality?
Yeah, that steps into the culture piece, Rob, in terms of how do you build and create and support a culture that encourages that. And I think we're seeing it happen at an executive level and at a manager level across a lot of industries, where they're seeing, first of all, that social sharing within the organization tends to lead to faster response, more innovation, and these sorts of things. But also social sharing across the industry. In other words, this whole concept of co-opetition, which is an American term, I think, which is where we collaborate, we compete, but we collaborate, is really important. And I think that's being seen. I certainly am seeing that a lot more. I sit down with maybe senior learning and development people in a range of banks, and they're a group of companies which are competing in the pharma or in engineering or in any sort of area. And we see that people are very open to sharing what they're doing, because in L&D, you're focused on building or helping to build high capability, high performance levels in your organization, and actually you're not really in competition. Well, you might argue that maybe you're in competition with an organization which is in the same industry as you, but actually we're all about trying to build excellence and build expertise. So we're seeing a lot of that. And I think that it really comes down to taking away barriers and building tools and implementing tools which support. So removing the barriers. For example, I've seen in pharma over the last few years where research teams working on one particular drug set were not allowed to communicate and share their ideas with their colleagues working on different drug sets. That's pretty well gone now, because in pharma, it's all about innovation. Because if you're not getting drugs patented through to patent and through to sale, that's your business gone. So you've got to be highly innovative to do that. So we're seeing on one side, in terms of structures breaking down and encouraging more sharing and collaboration. And on the other side, I think we're seeing better tools and technologies coming along, which is supporting the ability to do that. And that is really critical. Just as going back to Jay Cross's statement, giving people the ability to talk to each other and making sure and providing the technology which allows them to share ideas, share good practice, capture ideas about things they've seen, their rich experiences, their challenging experiences, share those out and make sure they're not replicated, or the challenges, the mistakes aren't replicated elsewhere. And I've seen that over the years. I worked for Dow Jones, for the financial part of Dow Jones back in the late 90s. And some senior managers came to me and said, Charles, we'd like you to develop some training programs to help people understand more about our customers. And when we did the analysis, we discovered that what they really needed was they needed some way of sharing their experiences and expertise. So if, for example, someone from Dow Jones Markets had been talking to maybe someone in Citibank in Hong Kong, the fact that they could gather and capture the experiences and the information they had and then share it with someone who was going to speak to someone else with another client in Hong Kong, or someone else in a Citibank office in Berlin or in New York or somewhere. So actually what they needed was some sort of knowledge base and performance support tools and some way to capture that shared knowledge base. And I think that's a really critical element of this sharing, sort of thinking outside the idea that formal learning is the only way in which people develop, and actually saying, hey, we can exploit a lot and learn a lot from what our colleagues know and learn and the experiences they have.
Yeah, I found, and we've had this conversation a few times on the podcast, where the capturing part, I think, is where a lot of people do find a bit of challenge. They have figured out their frameworks for measuring their formal learning, right? They have the surveys in place, they have the whole BI tools, but it's when they get into the social learning aspect and some of the coaching and some of the knowledge sharing that it becomes maybe a little bit more challenging to track that and report it as a business impact.
Yeah, I would often even question the need to track it, because it's one input which is going to have an effect on the overall output. And in fact, I think that as a general rule, as an industry, learning and development has not got its head around measuring what it does. I mean, we try and convert learning metrics into business metrics. We don't tend to start at the other end. And one of the things we do at the 70-20-10 Institute, we only focus on business metrics. So if we're looking to see the impact of some learning intervention or some support in learning and development, we always start with measuring, defining the business metrics that we're going to use, or the business metrics that the key stakeholders want to use, and work back from there. So, what are the first level customer support resolutions that occur? What are the percentages of that? Or what is the bottom line sales figures? Or it could be anything. It could be productivity figures. It could be all sorts of things. That's where we need to start in terms of measuring. Now, trying to unpick the causal chains, in other words, to take it back to where has social learning had an impact on that final output, I think is probably chasing a holy grail which maybe doesn't exist. We need to do these things and then measure, is the overall output improving? Is the overall metric that we're looking at improving? That's enough, rather than trying to... Dean Spitzer, who worked at IBM for many, many years, had a model where you break down into the causal chains and measure all the links, incredibly complex, incredibly time-consuming, and in the end, unreliable and probably not worth the effort, to be honest.
So, Charles, just final question for today. What advice would you give to businesses who are either about to launch, building to launch, or are already having launched a social learning initiative?
Well, I'd say go for it, because we learn socially. We need to be supported. We need to take down the barriers that inhibit social exchanges, capturing experiences, capturing great successes, capturing challenges, capturing failures, capturing all of this, and sharing that is really, really critical. We just could not do our jobs without that social aspect, and we need to think about it in terms of how we learn as well. And I guess that I've, for years, have said that there are 4 basic ways in which adults learn and work, and that's through experience, through practice, through conversations and networking, and through reflection. And actually, when you think about the social elements there, we can have rich and challenging experiences, but we will learn from them individually, but if we share them, other people can learn from those. We learn from practice. Yeah, sure, that's principally around individuals, but few of us work as individuals. We work as teams, so that's usually a group learning together. We obviously learn from conversations and networks. I mentioned Rob Cross earlier on, the work that he's done and his teams have done to show that managers who are better networked are better performers. So we know that. And also reflection is really powerful. And we can reflect individually, but also we can reflect as a team, as a group. So there's a social element there in terms of reflecting on what we've done and thinking about how that's affected us. And if we take, for example, a formal learning program or an e-learning program, we can reflect on what we've put into practice, how it's worked, what we've learned from that, what our reflections are. And that can become a process of continuous improvement, both for the designers of formal learning. It can also become a process, more importantly, of continuous improvement for the organization.
Well, Charles, thank you so much for sharing all of your valuable knowledge today with us.
That's an absolute pleasure, Rob and Kerry.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. We'll speak to you soon.
For more information on what we've discussed today, including links to resources and downloadable assets, go to docebo.com/podcast. That's docebo.com/podcast. And subscribe to our newsletter.
You can also find us on iTunes, Spotify, and all other places where you get your podcasts by searching Learning Elevated. So don't forget to click subscribe so you know when we're disembarking on another floor.